So before we go to our other panelists, why don't we just go through these real quickly. Half of the U.S. at this point has adopted very aggressive climate policies. As you can see here, they're concentrated on the West Coast, of course, but also in the Northeast, and then other parts of the country. And by comprehensive, we mean economy-wide climate goals. Most of them are along the lines of 40% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2030 and 80% by 2050. And you can see on the right box there that this half of the country represents a big chunk of the population, the gross domestic product, much of the on-road fuel, and the vast majority of heating oil used. So how are they going to achieve those targets? Well, I think the answer on the West Coast, in large part, is based on low carbon or clean fuels programs. You'll note that these go by a variety of names. In California, it's the Low Carbon Fuel Standard. In Oregon, it's the Clean Fuels Program. Washington State is the Clean Fuels Standard, but they all pretty much mean the same thing. This is an example, I think you saw this in Louis' presentation. All three programs have very similar compliance curves. The state adopts a set of declining carbon intensity reduction targets that are designed to achieve a specific objective or a carbon reduction target. One compliance target for gasoline and its substitutes, and another compliance curve for diesel and its substitutes. Let's see, California's has been in place since 2010, 2011. Oregon's is 2015, 2016. Washington's is due to kick in next year. Just high level, high takeaway, these have been very successful, as I said, with substantial environmental, public health, and economic benefits, as you heard earlier. A couple of factoids: 22.3 billion gallons of petroleum displaced, this is California and Oregon combined to date, and $4.5 billion worth of credits that have been generated, again, for both of those states. Like I said, the concept is pretty straightforward. One of the important features of this type of design is that when you generate a credit, and the credit is generated if your fuel has a CI that's below the standard for that year, generates a deficit if it's above, and at the end of the year, if your credits outweigh your deficits, you're good to go, or you can even sell the excess. If you're short, you have to go out and buy some from someone who has available credits. One important feature of this design is that you have the two compliance curves. So regulated parties that are exceeding or generating excess credits can then sell. These credits are fungible once they're converted into a metric ton of GHG reduction. So they're fungible between gasoline to diesel or vice versa. And that's important to note because when we designed the LCFS, we had every expectation that electric vehicles and cellulosic ethanol was going to take off. That didn't happen, and electric vehicles are just now starting to gain momentum. But in the absence of that takeoff, biomass-based diesel really kind of stood up and played that role that we were expecting other fuels to do, and they did so in a very spectacular way. And in fact, as I'll show in the next slide, they've done the heavy lifting of carbon reductions. Another important feature that most folks don't realize with these sort of programs is they actually serve as an accelerator for electric vehicle deployment. They do that by helping to provide revenues into the investments for electric vehicles. I believe our speakers will speak to that. In my mind, the way it's been working in California and Oregon is kind of this amalgam of the positive benefits of a electric vehicle mandate working working in complement to a market-based fuel standard. I think as you heard Michael Wang, he's still here, and others talk about these sort of programs are based on a full life cycle assessment. I won't go into that, but the main thing to remember here, I think as Professor Brown mentioned earlier, is that the tailpipe emissions of carbon dioxide is offset by the recent sequestration of carbon dioxide during the biomass's growth cycle, and therefore those two cancel out, and all you're left with are just the small residual GHG emissions that are released during the other steps in the life cycle. That gives biofuels a distinct advantage over other fuels, and especially over fossil fuels. Okay, so I like to use this as kind of a, to encapsulate the state of the program in California as an exemplar of these types of programs. I will depend on Corianne to talk about her state's success with this program as well. On the left, I think I showed this earlier, but just a little bit more granularity on it. Last few years, since 2017, biodiesel and renewable diesel have generated almost half of the carbon reductions in the LCFS program. But you can also see growth in both electric vehicles, or electricity that's used in electric vehicles, which is the orange. I'm told that I'm colorblind, but it looks orange to me. The orange columns, and then the red columns are renewable natural gas. So both of those fuels are being incentivized to innovate and expand. And so for those who are under the impression that a low carbon fuel standard stymies electric vehicle deployment, I think this says a different story. It fosters innovations in both biofuels and also helps to accelerate electric vehicle deployment as well as renewable natural gas. So as you can see here, 44%, about 44–45% of the carbon reductions over the last few years have been from these two fuels. That's important, as I mentioned earlier, from a health standpoint, because these are coming from displacing petroleum diesel that in turn results in substantial reductions in diesel PM, which helps to benefit those who are disproportionately impacted by that. On the right basically translates this growth or the contribution of biodiesel and renewable diesel as far as carbon reductions, translates that into growth in absolute gallons. You can see here a combination of complementary programs like Low Carbon Fuel Standard, Biodiesel Tax Credit, RFS. Those have combined to foster a growth of these two fuels from 14 million gallons in 2011 at the start of the program to over 1.23 billion gallons as of last year. To put that in context, California has about 3.6 billion gallon diesel market, so that 1.23 is fully a third of the diesel pool is comprised of renewable biomass-based diesel. Just kind of wrap your head around that, and we've been able to do that in the span of 10 years. In fact, the first quarter of this year, these two fuels comprised 44% of the diesel pool. We are fast approaching half of the diesel pool being completely renewable and sustainable. Is that the end of the story? I don't think so. I think California's own modeling for their scoping plan, this is the roadmap for achieving carbon neutrality by 2045, shows the preferred staff scenario shows the scenario includes the use of 2.4 billion gallons of biodiesel and renewable diesel. So that's a doubling of current levels through 2030. And so, you know, it's not just a, hey, this is great now, but what about the future? It actually does look to be potential for substantial growth in the coming years. To put this growth into dollar figures, here is a graph showing the credit values at the prices of the credits as they were generated in the different years. The area under the curve is the cumulative credit generated. That equals about 4.4 billion gallons. This is just biodiesel and renewable diesel. And just last year, 6.8 million credits, so that's 6.8 million metric tons of GHG reductions. Those are valued at about $1.34 billion. So that translates into a value of about $1.60 per gallon from the credits. I'm sorry, did I say last year? I meant 2020. I didn't have data for last year. I will let Corianne and I'll let Corianne talk about her program. Suffice this to say, as I said earlier, both California and Oregon are looking to double down on their carbon intensity reduction targets. California is publicly workshopping a 25 and 30% reduction target by 2030. They're currently at 20%. And Oregon is considering a 37% by 2035. So it's sort of one-upmanship that we like to see. I'm always a big fan of competition between regulatory agencies. And then, as you can see here, so Oregon's similar to California's in terms of a compliance curve, same sort of structure. Washington's very similar. The main difference is a hardwired program review between 2031 and 2033. This represents the targets that are set in 2038. So they're positioning that state to be as synchronized with California and Oregon as much as possible. And then my last slide here is, yes, these are very well established in the West Coast. It will soon be in Washington State. Other states are considering this as well. So New Mexico has gone through a couple of legislative sessions, almost passed last year, it missed it by one vote. So we anticipate they'll go again. Nevada and Colorado have a low carbon fuel standard identified in their climate strategies. And of course New York is going through that process of considering that, as you heard earlier in the earlier panel. So with that, that's kind of the landscape with low carbon fuel standard. I will ask Louis Brown to start us off with my home state. Louis Brown, again, is a partner in the firm of Conn, Soares & Conway, and you heard that before, so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Floyd. Good to see all of you again. I see they put Floyd's first panel right before lunch and his second panel right before cocktails. So they're trying to teach him a hard stop on talking, which
I'm just a glutton for punishment.
he may not have done a whole lot when he was at ARB. So we will kind of just go through and give you just a little bit more a historical perspective of California, the LCFS. Ours was started in the legislature, but unlike what you may have heard from Washington and see in some other states, it is very non-specific in the California statute. It actually just pretty much AB 32 started. It was a bill in 2010 signed by Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, and it basically directed ARB to put forth market-based programs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 15% by 2020. That was the bill. It had a little bit more little bit more in there about what some of those market-based programs were, but you didn't see anything about specific fuels, you didn't see anything about specific technologies. It basically said, here ARB, here's your goal, go out and get it done. And the low carbon fuel standard was part of one of those early action items. And then it went through from there and really starting a series of almost non-stop regulatory activity at the ARB since. SB 32 came by a few years later, and SB 32 almost even more simple than AB 32, just simply said, well, we're going to extend that out to 2030, and we're going to set that goal, we're going to move that goal to a 40% reduction by 2030. So that's been basically the role of the legislature in California when it's come to specifically this issue. Now, there have been other bills that have been introduced. SB 1383 specifically looks at methane emission reductions in landfills and dairy operations. SB 395 looks at building and building standards, emission reductions from building standards. But really, all of them follow this kind of the role that SB 32 and AB 32 started was here ARB, here regulatory agencies, here's your targets, go get it done.
Let's go ahead and introduce the panelists. So on the screen is Beth Dolio. She was a Washington State representative from 2017 to 2021. She's a community organizer, climate leader, and candidate for the House of Representatives in the 22nd Legislative District. She's been a champion for the most vulnerable neighbors, working families, youth, and seniors, and the environment. Serving in the legislature, Washington State Legislature from 2017 to 2021. She was one of Washington's foremost leaders on the environment, housing, gun safety, and issues facing working families. She's also worked at Climate Solutions, an environmental NGO in Washington since 2007, working to pass federal, state, and local climate policy, and serving as the director of the Power Past Coal campaign since its inception, making her an expert and a leader in efforts to defeat climate change and develop a clean energy economy. Please join me in welcoming Beth Dolio. So Beth, since you're on the screen, would you like to go first before I talk about the other carbon programs?
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to do that. Well, I'm really pleased to have been invited to join you today in this important work that we're all committed to. I am hopeful to return to the legislature and continue this work as a legislator, but I think I was really asked to join the panel because I have a unique view in having, in being an environmental advocate and working for climate solutions since 2007, is that what you said, as the campaign director. So I've seen environmental policy both from the outside and then as a legislator from the inside. I also have the honor of serving alongside Representative Fitzgibbon, who you heard from today. And I will say, without his leadership and hard work, Washington would not have a clean fuel standard in place. So I have worked for Climate Solutions, and just a little background on Climate Solutions. We're a regional nonprofit. We serve primarily Oregon and Washington, and our vision is a thriving, equitable Northwest that's powered by clean energy. And we work to inspire the transition to sustainable prosperity across the nation and beyond. And our mission is accelerating clean energy solutions like biofuels to the climate crisis. So I was asked to provide some insights today on Washington's Clean Fuels program, and I'm going to talk specifically about the campaign to pass this fuel standard in Washington, hopefully to give you some ideas about, some really best standards and best practices around that, and why I think biofuels play a very key role in transitioning to cleaner transportation, and really thoughts about how you position yourselves in this fight. So you may have heard this already from Joe, I'm not sure, but transportation accounts for about 45% of our statewide greenhouse gas emissions in Washington. And that's due, that sort of uneven distribution is due to a relatively carbon clean electric hydropower fueled electric grid. So taking on transportation emissions is incredibly important in our state's intention to meet significant emission reduction targets that are in statute. So in addition to that, while we were launching this campaign and working on this policy, we were surrounded by states who already had the programs in place. We do have some friendly competition amongst Oregon, California, and BC. Of course, we're trying to work collaboratively to help all of our states and BC be successful in reducing emissions. But we were concerned that we were going to lose out with those states in terms of biofuel and electrification economic opportunities. So that was definitely something that we talked with legislators about, and I talked with my colleagues about significantly. So the work on the policy began about a decade ago, and it was so controversial in the early days of the legislature that our 2016 legislative package, it came with a very high price. And that was the price that we couldn't have a clean fuel standard and a transportation package, a poison pill. So it was very, very discouraging, right? But, you know, about 5 years ago, Representative Fitzgibbon began really working in earnest to pass a clean fuel standard. We had bigger majorities in our legislature, so it afforded us that opportunity. And the road was long and arduous. We spent hours and hours of floor debate and time on this policy year after year until it finally passed, and it will go into effect in January of 2023. And specifically, it requires fuel suppliers to gradually reduce the carbon intensity of transportation fuels to 20% below 2017 levels by 2038. All right, so how did we get there? One, we had a really broad range of stakeholders that supported passage. Businesses, unions, local government officials, environmental organizations, biofuel companies, automakers, electrification companies, health organizations. We had people as diverse as the sheet metal workers and IBEW, to waste management, Union of Concerned Scientists, General Motors, Toyota, shellfish producers, Seattle City Light, Tacoma Public Utility. It was a very, very big tent. And part of that was marshaling all of those resources. We had a very well-resourced and highly coordinated campaign. There was a separate business table that strategized together and also provided funding for advertisements, for field organizers, for lobbyists. So it was well-resourced. And they also paid for a really unique campaign tactic that mobilized restaurants who recycled their oils, their used oils. And that was in key legislative districts, places where we knew we needed to have votes. Those legislators would go home for the weekend and go to restaurants in their districts and see those signs in those restaurant windows supporting clean fuels. Creative tactics like that. There was a large environmental table that had big greens and small environmental organizations that worked to mobilize their grassroots memberships to pressure the legislature. And then we had a very highly skilled campaign manager who was housed at Climate Solutions that coordinated all these activities amongst the lobbyists and the various organizing tables. 3, there is an agreement that the policy would be fuel neutral. No winners, no losers. Fuels simply are simply judged on their carbon intensity. And again, this really allowed for a lot of people to come in. And number 4, they had an agreement that passing that policy was more important than the policy disagreements around the edges. So those disagreements were put into the rulemaking process to be ironed out, which we've been working on for this last year or so. And you know, those disagreements were mostly around who gets the credits and how should they be spent. And you know, that is playing out, and you know, we're generally pretty happy with how things are moving in that space. And finally, I think this is my final 5th point, it must be equity-centered policy and approach. No question about it. We all know that low-income communities and communities of color suffer the most from air pollution and climate change. They also have the fewest resources to cope or to pay for healthcare. And often these communities are closest to highways and other roads with high volumes of traffic. So Washington's clean fuel standard will reduce air pollutants in these vulnerable communities. near transportation corridors, as well as address the greenhouse gas emissions. Under the standard, electric utilities in the state are required to invest at least 30% of their electrification investments in areas with poor air quality, helping to ensure the program's benefits flow directly to those communities. All right, I'm just going to go briefly back to the fuel neutrality and the big tent and how strategic the biofuels industry was in the campaign. And then some of those folks are among you today. So as you all know, there is tremendous momentum around electrification, right? That is the big thing. It's what I'm working on in the building sector right now myself, is electrifying buildings. And you in the Northeast are also, working on that, and you can take advantage of that momentum in working towards implementing a clean fuel standard. If the policy is fuel neutral, biofuels are well positioned to be a big part of that solution. And as you're talking to different audiences, not everybody relates to the same thing. You can really, really tailor your message to your audience with that big tent. So who is your audience? What do you want to emphasize? Is it biofuels or electrification or air quality and health benefits, equity? It's important, I think, that the key here is that it's important to put your North Star goal of passing a clean fuel standard above the individual benefits of any particular industry. So you have a lot to gain as an industry, right? Transportation needs are never going to be fully satisfied by vehicle electrification. Certain vehicles will just not immediately transition to electrification. Heavy duty trucks and vehicles used by utilities in particular to serve electrical lines. And biofuels are available today, right now, that can drop in. They're drop-in fuels, and we can serve harder to get sectors. Just one note of interest on this is that the Port of Seattle, and they operate our major airport, SeaTac, and Alaska Airlines, which is headquartered in Seattle, endorsed the passage of the clean fuel standards, and airlines can opt in and generate credits for biofuels they use in the operations of their jets. So yet another incentive for them to utilize your products. So as we think through how to move forward in the Northeast, which I'm super excited that this conversation is happening, please know that folks in Washington and Oregon, and I'm sure California and BC, are so ready to assist and provide insights and materials, campaign plans, anything that will help you to be successful. And I look forward to the rest of the panel.
Beth, thank you for those great insights. I think Washington is proof positive that something Donnell said earlier about these groundbreaking, innovative policies really do, in many cases, take years to develop. And I think the Clean Fuel Standard in Washington is proof of that. It begs the question, of course, is it worth the wait? And I think after you hear this panel, I think you'll come away with the conclusion that it actually is. And these programs, the way they've been operating on the West Coast, and we anticipate in Washington State, have succeeded spectacularly beyond expectations of the folks who originally designed them. I would know, since I was part of the original LCFS team. Certainly, it's one of those most successful greenhouse gas reduction programs, and we'll go over that in more detail and talk about the benefits of this type of program. Thank you, Beth. If you can stand by while we switch over to the, can we switch over? All right, here we go. All right, so before we go to our other panelists, why don't we just go through these real quickly. Half of the U.S. at this point has adopted very aggressive climate policies. As you can see here, they're concentrated on the West Coast, of course, but also in the Northeast, and then other parts of the country. And by comprehensive, we mean economy-wide climate goals. Most of them are along the lines of 40% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2030 and 80% by 2050. And you can see on the right box there that this half of the country represents a big chunk of the population, the gross domestic product, much of the on-road fuel, and the vast majority of heating oil used. So how are they going to achieve those targets? Well, I think the answer on the West Coast, in large part, is based on low carbon or clean fuels programs. You'll note that these go by a variety of names. In California, it's the Low Carbon Fuel Standard. In Oregon, it's the Clean Fuels Program. Washington State is the Clean Fuels Standard, but they all pretty much mean the same thing. This is an example, I think you saw this in Louis' presentation. All three programs have very similar compliance curves. The state adopts a set of declining carbon intensity reduction targets that are designed to achieve a specific objective or a carbon reduction target. One compliance target for gasoline and its substitutes, and another compliance curve for diesel and its substitutes. Let's see, California's has been in place since 2010, 2011. Oregon's is 2015, 2016. Washington's is due to kick in next year. Just high level takeaway, these have been very successful, as I said, with substantial environmental, public health, and economic benefits, as you heard earlier. A couple of factoids: 22.3 billion gallons of petroleum displaced. This is California and Oregon combined to date. And $4.5 billion worth of credits that have been generated, again, for both of those states. Like I said, the concept is pretty straightforward. One of the important features of this type of design is that when you generate a credit, and the credit is generated if your fuel has a CI that's below the standard for that year, generates a deficit if it's above, and at the end of the year, if your credits outweigh your deficits, you're good to go, or you can even sell the excess. If you're short, you have to go out and buy some from someone who has available credits. One important feature of this design is that you have the two compliance curves. So regulated parties that are exceeding or generating excess credits can then sell. These credits are fungible once they're converted into a metric ton of GHG reduction. So they're fungible between gasoline to diesel or vice versa. And that's important to note because when we designed the LCFS, we had every expectation that electric vehicles and cellulosic ethanol was going to take off. That didn't happen, and electric vehicles are just now starting to gain momentum. But in the absence of that takeoff, biomass-based diesel really kind of stood up and played that role that we were expecting other fuels to do, and they did so in a very spectacular way. And in fact, as I'll show in the next slide, they've done the heavy lifting of carbon reductions. Another important feature that most folks don't realize with these sort of programs is they actually serve as an accelerator for electric vehicle deployment. They do that by helping to provide revenues into the investments for electric vehicles, and I believe our speakers will speak to that. So, in my mind, the way it's been working in California and Oregon is kind of this amalgam of the positive benefits of a electric vehicle mandate working working in complement to a market-based fuel standard. I think as you heard Michael Wang, he's still here, and others talk about these sort of programs are based on a full life cycle assessment. I won't go into that, but the main thing to remember here, I think as Professor Brown mentioned earlier, is that the tailpipe emissions of carbon dioxide is offset by the recent sequestration of carbon dioxide during the biomass's growth cycle. And therefore, those two cancel out, and all you're left with are just the small residual GHG emissions that are released during the other steps in the life cycle. That gives biofuels a distinct advantage over other fuels, and especially over fossil fuels. Okay, so I like to use this as kind of a, to encapsulate the state of the program in California as an exemplar of these types of programs. I will depend on Corianne to talk about her state's success with this program as well. On the left, I think I showed this earlier, but just a little bit more granularity on it. Last few months, or last few years, since 2017, biodiesel and renewable diesel have generated almost half of the carbon reductions in the LCFS program. But you can also see growth in both electric vehicles, or electricity that's used in electric vehicles, which is the orange. I'm told that I'm colorblind, but it looks orange to me. The orange columns, and then the red columns are renewable natural gas. So both of those fuels are being incentivized to innovate and expand. And so for those who are under the impression that a low carbon fuel standard stymies electric vehicle deployment, I think this says a different story. It fosters innovations in both biofuels and also helps to accelerate electric vehicle deployment, as well as renewable natural gas. So as you can see here, 44%, about 45% of the carbon reductions over the last few years have been from these two fuels. That's important, as I mentioned earlier, from a health standpoint, because these are coming from displacing petroleum diesel that in turn results in substantial reductions in diesel PM, which helps to benefit those who are disproportionately impacted by that. On the right, basically translates this growth or the contribution of biodiesel and renewable diesel as far as carbon reductions, translates that into growth in absolute gallons. You could see here a combination of complementary programs like low carbon fuel standard, biodiesel tax credit, RFS. Those have combined to foster a growth of these two fuels from 14 million gallons in 2011 at the start of the program to over 1.23 billion gallons as of last year. To put that in context, California has about 3.6 billion gallon diesel market. So that 1.23 is fully a third of the diesel pool is comprised of renewable biomass-based diesel. Just kind of wrap your head around that. And we've been able to do that in the span of 10 years. In fact, the first quarter of this year, these two fuels comprised 44% of the diesel pool. We are fast approaching half of the diesel pool being completely renewable and sustainable. Is that the end of the story? I don't think so. I think California's own modeling for their scoping plan, this is the roadmap for achieving carbon neutrality by 2045, shows the preferred staff scenario shows the scenario includes the use of 2.4 billion gallons of biodiesel and renewable diesel. So that's a doubling of current levels through 2030. And so, it's not just hey, this is great now, but what about the future? It actually does look to be potential for substantial growth in the coming years. To put this growth into dollar figures, here is a graph showing the credit values at the prices of the credits as they were generated in the different years. The area under the curve is the cumulative credit generated. That equals about 4.4 billion gallons. This is just biodiesel and renewable diesel. And just last year, 6.8 million credits, so that's 6.8 million metric tons of GHG reductions. Those are valued at about $1.34 billion. So that translates into a value of about $1.60 per gallon from the credits. I'm sorry, did I say it last year? I meant 2020. I didn't have data for last year. I will let Corianne and I'll let Corianne talk about her program. Suffices to say, as I said earlier, both California and Oregon are looking to double down on their carbon intensity reduction targets. California is publicly workshopping a 25 and 30% reduction target by 2030. They're currently at 20%. And Oregon is considering a 37% by 2035. So it's sort of one-upmanship that we like to see. I'm always a big fan of competition between regulatory agencies. And then, as you can see here, so Oregon's similar to California's in terms of a compliance curve, same sort of structure. Washington's very similar. The main difference is a hardwired program review between 2031 and 2033. This represents the targets that are set forth in statute, but because of the way the statute is written, there was flexibility in how fast those reductions are achieved. And so the Washington state regulators have put out a draft regulation that's currently working its way through the process that has a 20% CI target by 2034 rather than 2038. So they're positioning that state to be in as synchronized with California, with California and Oregon as much as possible. And then my last slide here is, yes, these are very well established in the West Coast. It will soon be in Washington State. Other states are considering this as well. So New Mexico has gone through a couple of legislative sessions, almost passed last year, it missed it by one vote. So we anticipate they'll go again. Nevada and Colorado have a low carbon fuel standard identified in their climate strategies. And of course, New York is going through that process of considering that, as you heard earlier in the earlier panel. So with that, that's kind of the landscape with low carbon fuel standard. I will ask Louis Brown to start us off with my home state. Louis Brown, again, is a partner in the firm of Conn, Soares and Conway, and you heard that before, so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Floyd. Good to see all of you again. I see they put Floyd's first panel right before lunch and his second panel right before cocktails. So they're trying to teach him a hard stop on talking, which
I'm just a glutton for punishment.
he may not have done a whole lot when he was at ARB. So we will kind of just go through and give you just a little bit more of a historical perspective of California, the LCFS. Ours was started in the legislature, but unlike what you may have heard from Washington and see in some other states, it is very non-specific in the California statute. It actually just pretty much, AB 32 started. It was a bill in 2010 signed by Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, and it basically directed ARB to put forth a market-based programs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 15% by 2020. That was the bill. It had a little bit more in there about what some of those market-based programs were, but you didn't see anything about specific fuels. You didn't see anything about specific technologies. It basically said, here ARB, here's your goal, go out and get it done. And the low carbon fuel standard was part of one of those early action items. And then it went through from there and really starting a series of almost nonstop regulatory activity at the ARB since. SB 32 came by a few years later, and SB 32, almost even more simple than AB 32, just simply said, well, we're going to extend that out to 2030, and we're going to set that goal. We're going to move that goal to a 40% reduction by 2030. So that's been basically the role of the legislature in California when it's come to specifically this issue. Now, there have been other bills that have been introduced. SB 1383 specifically looks at methane emission reductions in landfills and dairy operations. SB 395 looks at building and building standards, emission reductions from building standards. But really, all of them follow this kind of the role that SB 32 and AB 32 started was here. ARB, here, regulatory agencies, here's your targets, go get it done. And so, like was said, it was originally adopted in 09, actually 2010, and then the first regulations came into place. We had a little bit of a hiccup in California ARB with a lawsuit that kind of stopped things, froze them in place for a period of about 3 years. And so in 2015, the ARB readopted the low carbon fuel standard in an effort to address some of the issues that were brought up in that litigation. And we've been moving forward ever since. The basic benefits and goals of the low carbon fuel standard, first and foremost, diversify the fuel pool, reduce petroleum dependency, and then reduce emissions. You saw a little bit of this on the earlier panel, the two basics really that drive the low carbon fuel standard in California. It sets these annual CI carbon intensity benchmarks, and those that carbon intensity is based on life cycle analyses. And like it was said earlier in an earlier panel, that is a constantly evolving area of science and discussion. We've seen it through definitely on the renewable diesel and biodiesel side in the analysis looking in agriculture and crops and that full spectrum of a life cycle analysis. Zero emission vehicles, electric vehicles, could potentially see a little bit more attention in this next scoping plan and the next plan moving forward. Just the other day, a week or two ago, within the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee that advises ARB on these types of issues, they started to raise the issue of adding lithium and lithium mining and what goes into the batteries of electric vehicles into that discussion of a life cycle analysis, which hasn't really been part of that full analysis of electric vehicles and their CI scores up until this time. So it'll be interesting to see how that conversation continues to evolve. Floyd showed this slide a little bit and really shows what we're after. And frankly, one of the reasons why the ARB in this new scoping plan comes out and is likely going to set even more aggressive targets is because the CI scores in California are beating the benchmark on a regular basis. And we actually are expecting the ARB to introduce and start formal rulemaking amendments to the LCFS next year to make those targets in the LCFS regulation more aggressive through that 2030 target. Floyd showed this slide as well, and about the role that renewable diesel and biodiesel have played. Again, this is significant just from the perspective, and I mentioned this in the earlier panel, we have 2 million trucks in the state of California. We don't really know what the inventory is of off-road vehicles, agricultural vehicles, construction vehicles, but they all come in with 3.5 to 4 billion gallons a year in diesel use. And we know that this will be the hardest sector to electrify. And so even the ARB in the recent scoping plan and documents moving forward emphasize the need and the importance and the role
that liquid biofuels, particularly renewable diesel and biodiesel, are going to play in those sectors going forward. Because while we have goals to electrify the passenger vehicle side of the industry, there are really no goals as of yet on the heavy duty vehicles. It's a little harder to read, but it does emphasize what Floyd was talking about on how the low carbon fuel standard in California has actually incentivized the growth of electric vehicles. In fact, it was just announced, I believe, last week that due to the credits generated by the low carbon fuel standard, more than $320 million has been given as incentives for California consumers to purchase electric vehicles. And our governor right now has a little thing going with a guy by the name of Elon Musk. In fact, said the other day there would be no Tesla without California regulations and California regulatory bodies because of the benefits that Tesla, as one, has received from those credits that have been generated by the low carbon fuel standard. And then again, Floyd picked up on this, but we continue to see this growth in biodiesel and renewable diesel. And one of the reasons, and someone was talking about it earlier in the first panel, was the pricing. And one of the things that we're now seeing in California, and particularly a number of the large truck stops, have transitioned to 100% renewable diesel, biodiesel blends. We have, and have talked about this throughout, there's parts of the I-5 corridor in California where you simply, if you're at a large truck stop, you cannot find petroleum diesel. And the carbon intensity scores help make that happen. Biodiesel, especially if it's produced in California, principally produced with tallow and rendering, it has a lower carbon intensity score, gives it greater credit prices, allows it to bring that price of renewable diesel down, making it extremely competitive throughout the state of California, where in some of those truck stops you just see no difference, or frankly, you'll see those renewable diesel, biodiesel blends actually cheaper than petroleum diesel in many of those places. So next steps, we are in the process, like Floyd said, California has just started to workshop and will adopt the next scoping plan for our greenhouse gas emission goals by the end of the year. After that, we'll start the next process, the next phase of looking at the low carbon fuel standard, making amendments to that, all in an effort to reach that carbon neutrality goal of 2045 that the state has, all in the effort of trying to move away from petroleum diesel as soon as we possibly can. It's been a very positive program in California. We've seen significant economic growth from it, from the fact that right now we're seeing any number of major producers now switching into the renewable diesel industry for the purposes of the market share that's now starting to create in California. So with that, Floyd, I'll turn it over and be available for questions.
Thanks, Louis. Great overview of California. Our next speaker is Corey-Ann Wind, who I've had the pleasure of working with probably over a decade now or so. She works for the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality as the Oregon Clean Fuels Program Manager. She's worked for ODEC for over 28 years, the last 11 of which was in fuels, transportation, and climate policy. Corey-Ann holds a bachelor's in bioresources engineering from Oregon State University. Please join me in welcoming Corey-Ann Wind. There you go.
Thank you, everybody. And thank you for inviting me to come and speak here today. So I'm going to play this role of basically everything that you heard this morning and all throughout the day. Yes, 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 yes. My perspective from running the Oregon Clean Fuels Program for the past 6 years that we've been implementing it, but I've been with the program since we first started our policy development back in 2010. And so it's a really good time for me to be able to kind of get out and tell other states how successful we have been in the first 6 years of the program, not to ego build, but to get more people on board, right? I think one of the things that you heard this morning too is that the more states that get on, the more demand you create, the lower the costs get, and it just gets bigger and better. There is a lot of friendly competition that happens on the West Coast, and we really do welcome more Midwest and East Coast states to participate in that. It is a great collaboration that we do have amongst the state officials as we do talk about policy, whether it is LCFS, whether it is ZEV regulations, clean air. All of those facets are wound up in the clean, excuse me, in the Clean Fuels program. And it's really great to see just the evolution in the discussion and the policy in the market, frankly. So what I'll start with is just kind of like status of the Oregon program. So we started implementing our Clean Fuels program back in 2016. So it was 5 years after California and BC started. We did have significant legislative issues getting our bill passed, getting the program started as well. Maybe not as much as Washington, but still it was controversial. And largely it was because of what were the cost impacts of the fuels. Right, I think that is usually the driving controversy about this. But as we've been able to show in the first 6 years of the program, it's, we've shown that it's not all doom and gloom with that. So just to give you a little bit of background, Oregon is a state where we do have a state renewable fuel standard that requires E10, B5, and all of the on-road gallons. And that was really the only kind of standing policy that we had regarding fuels in the state. We use about 1.5 billion gallons of gasoline and about 800 million gallons of diesel. So generally we say we're about 10% of California. And so, of course, New York will be, in between there. But since we started the program, we have the program has transitioned to a lot more clean fuels. We've got about, through the first quarter of this year, 7.3 million tons of greenhouse gases have been reduced. That displaces over 1.5 billion gallons of fossil fuels to date. So that's essentially taking out, like a whole year's worth of like gasoline consumption for Oregon. A lot of the criticisms too of whether low carbon fuel standards were really going to work in Oregon. Well, we already had a blend mandate of the 10% ethanol, 5% biodiesel. But in the biodiesels and the renewable diesels and the ethanols that we have before, the carbon intensities of those have decreased incrementally. And then stepwise also, when you've heard the discussions about going from like a crop seed biodiesel to a waste base, you get a lot of reductions that way. But you also get incremental improvements as the producers just get better and more efficient about how they operate their plants, how they get their fuels to Oregon, and how it's distributed. And we look forward to more innovation, for example, in the space of ethanol, working on CCS protocols and working with more of the agricultural practices that can bring those carbon intensities down. Those blend rates for E10 have largely remained about E10. There's a little quirk in our Oregon Constitution that actually causes gasoline to have no more or no less than 10% gasoline, ethanol, but that has recently changed. So 2022 is the first year that you can blend upwards of E10 for on the gasoline side. So we do think that we're going to be seeing higher levels of ethanol blending because of the carbon intensities being lower and because of the credits in the fuel for the Clean Fuels program. It's cheaper. So the higher blends that you go, the product will be cheaper to the end user. On the biodiesel side, we started with the B5. There are quarters now that we've been upwards of 15% of the biomass-based diesels. So just, again, due to market conditions, not due to any kind of mandates or anything, we've seen that increase steadily as the program has progressed. And I think the last thing that I want to point out on here to that last bullet, the credits that go to our electric utilities for electric vehicle credits. We are a state that doesn't have a lot of public money into incenting electric vehicles. We do have a rebate program that's about $12 million a year. But other than that, there's no other, energy commission money, there's no other cap and trade revenue, those kinds of things. And so the clean fuels credits that go to the electric utilities are very, very valuable in doing some initial infrastructure work, education and outreach, grants to community-based organizations. So that's like $45 million that did not exist prior to the Clean Fuels program that are now used as those foundational pilot projects to actually show and expand electrification as well. As Floyd was pointing to, what is the impact of the fuels of Clean Fuels program on the Oregon market? So for Oregon, for like last year, if you just take the amount of credits that were traded in the program, it's about $125 million, right? So that is not insignificant. This is what is leading to continuous transformation of the lower carbon fuels market. It is making, again, driving down those CI scores and bringing more of it to the state. There are, and this is money that the state doesn't have, right? I don't have money, I don't have a budget to actually incent these fuels. It is purely based on the market mechanism of the program to allow this to happen. And we are seeing the results of that. The credit prices that are set for the program, I mean, we don't establish it. The market sets the program, sets the prices. And so last year we averaged about $125 per ton of GHGs reduced. What's significant about that is that, we started in 2016, and I think the narrative has always been Oregon is always going to be the taker to California, right? We're 5 years behind, we're a smaller market, et cetera, et cetera. But like right now, the credit prices in Oregon are actually higher than the credit prices in California. Not going to say why, but I mean, it's the thing is that depending on just how you structure your program, how you structure your targets, you able to monitor what the kind of demand and the supply for the credits and the deficit are in your state. And you do come up with, it is possible to have conditions where the credit prices in Oregon are higher right now, right? So what does that mean to me? This means that all the fuels that are being sucked into California right now, there is more of that coming to Oregon because of the market signal. People are awake and they do see the credit prices, and it makes sense to figure out the logistics of getting that fuel to your lower carbon fuel state. And then as far as like the cost of compliance with the program, so again, when we started, we had consultants say, oh, this is going to add like $1 a gallon of, to a gallon of gas or diesel. And what we're actually required to do by our state legislatures to report on an annual basis about what the cost of compliance is. So what is that average credit price? If a regulated party had to go and buy all of their credits on the market, how much would that cost? And so last year, that runs about 5 to 6 cents per gallon of gas or diesel, right? And if you see the volatility in the prices of the fuels this year alone, right? 5 and 6 cents a gallon is minuscule compared to the $1.50 kind of volatility swings that we've seen this year. And so, I mean, I'm not going to say that there isn't a cost, right? But I think in the grand scheme of like all of the other exogenous things that go on the globe, that is a cost that has been acceptable. And I think like the panel was like before this, right? It's not like it's going to be no cost. It is a very low cost way to decarbonize the transportation fuel sector. And then what I did want to also point out too, I know we've alluded to it a lot today too, like in the graph in the far corner. So we talk about maybe the higher cost of the incremental, the fossil diesel and the fossil gasoline, but it is the clean fuels credits that are being generated by these lower carbon fuels that are bringing the price of a lot of these down and making it cost parity, if not cheaper, to take the lower carbon fuels. I think like what Floyd was saying too, if our truck stops, so B20 is widespread. B20 is cheaper than B5. Our state contract for diesel is on an R99 now, and I think it's a 3-cent differential from ULSB, right? So it is making it absolutely possible for the state fleet to meet its greenhouse gas reduction goals by using our renewable diesel. And for electricity too, the credit prices that we're seeing in Oregon now translate to about 8 cents per kilowatt, 13% cents per kilowatt hour type pricing, right? So that's the amount of credits that are being generated by electric vehicles, whether it's light duty or heavy duty vehicles. We also allow for retirement of RECs or renewable electricity energy credits to represent a zero carbon electricity. And so now the uptick of that is that about 70% of the electricity used to charge electric vehicles in Oregon are renewable, right? They're getting enough credit back on those clean fuels credits back on the price to be able to offset and then also put more investment into more infrastructure and more vehicles. So we see that in the fleets, especially on things like transit agencies, the Port of Portland, those kinds of big investments are really driving, again, the complementary ZEV regulations. And just kind of come to back to something that Floyd said earlier too. So Clean Fuels Program was the first of Oregon's big climate policies. Since there, we have adopted recently our Climate Protection Program. That's a cap and reduce program, economy-wide, and that kicks in 2022. It does cover transportation fuels. So what CFP does is actually gives those fuel providers a path to decarbonize and to meet those climate protection reduction goals. They know how to do it because they've already complied with clean fuels. And the more and more lower carbon you get, the easier it is to comply with the climate protection program. Additionally, we are 177 state. We've adopted Advanced Clean Trucks. We're in the process of adopting Advanced Clean Cars too. And again, it's that revenue from those credits that are generated in CFP that make that transition cheaper and quicker as well. We also have complementary clean energy bill that we passed in the legislature last year that will mandate clean energy, zero carbon electricity out to 2040. So again, to hit that goal of having 100% of the electricity for the electric vehicles be carbon neutral is a goal as well. And so it is, we need all of those policies to be working together to actually meet the state's decarbonization goals. Without having these aggressive targets, we just simply can't meet our climate goals that we have. And actually, I just wanted to add one thing because I didn't have a slide in here. But Floyd mentioned that we are expanding the program. So we're 6 years into Clean Fuels Program right now. And I'm in a rulemaking that will expand our targets out to 2035. So we're going from 10% reductions required in 2025 out to 37% reductions in 2035. This is part of the friendly competition between the West Coast states. All of the jurisdictions are basically in this mode now of what is it going to take from the clean fuels programs to actually get that decarbonization? And so what our modeling has shown, why we are targeting 37%, is because even if you're a ZEV state and you're like want everything to be ZEV, so ZEV gets you about 25% carbon intensity reductions. Okay, that means like if all you do is shoot for 25%, it's like you don't even need or you don't even want biofuels at all. We want the biofuels. We want the sustainable aviation fuel. We want the biodiesel. We want the renewable diesel. We want lower carbon ethanol. We want renewable natural gas, renewable propane, hydrogen. We want them all. And the only way you do that is by having an aggressive, target out to 2035, far in excess of what it would just electricity would get you. And that is why we're shooting for 37%. Okay.
Thank you, Corey Ann. For those of you who are in states that are considering a clean fuel standard sort of program, I highly recommend you follow Corey Ann's example as opposed to the one that I used to oversee, which is the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard. If for no other reason that she's been able to implement this program for 5 years now, 6 years, with 4 people, 5 if you do the accounting creatively. Whereas when I oversaw the program, I had 30 highly paid scientists and engineers and forensic accountants working on that program full time. So I don't know how she does it, but if you're looking for an example, ask for her, bring her over to your state, whatever you, yeah. Don't ask for me, ask for her. Our last speaker is Rich Castle. Rich, last but certainly not least, Rich Castle joined AJW as a partner in April 22nd, 2022, bringing his policy expertise and strategic skills on clean air, clean energy, green buildings, sustainable transportation, and other environmental issues. In addition to his work at AJW, Rich chairs EPA's Mobile Sources Technical Review Subcommittee, which provides independent advice and counsel on the agency's transportation and air quality programs. Rich spent more than 2 decades advocating on New York, national, and international clean air, energy, and transportation issues at the Natural Resources Defense Council, or NRDC. And his New York and national Dump Dirty Diesels campaigns helped launch a move towards cleaner trucks, buses, off-road diesel equipment, heating oil, and marine engines in New York and nationwide. Please join me in welcoming Rich Castle.
So this is the time when whoever gets stuck with this spot makes the requisite joke about standing between you and free drinks. In the interest of time and getting you to those free drinks, I'm not going to make that joke. But boom. But I am going to tell you a story. I'm going to tell you a story because we've spent the day getting a lot of great information and seeing a lot of slides that I'm sure plenty of us took pictures of or emailing for copies of. And so I'm going to start the end of the day with this story. So in the early 1990s, as Floyd mentioned, I was at NRDC, and I created something called the Dump Dirty Diesels campaign, which was the first campaign of its kind to really tackle diesel particulate emissions in disadvantaged communities head on with no pulling of punches. We actually sued for and won the right to put ads on the backs of New York City Transit buses that said standing behind this bus could be more dangerous than standing in front of it. Believe me, the MTA did not like running those ads. The tagline was "Diesel fumes can kill, demand clean fuel buses." We weren't kidding around. But the name of the campaign was Dump Dirty Diesels, not Dump Diesels, and that middle word was chosen for a reason. And the reason was we wanted to get to a solution point. We wanted to get to a point where the MTA first and then all other transit agencies would move towards what they were doing then, which was largely a fleet of 2-stroke diesels with minimal emission controls, some 4-stroke diesels with some emission controls, high sulfur diesel fuel, and so on. Steve Levy told a different version of this story early today. We had a ground war that lasted for years between the people, including me, I admit it, who thought CNG was the answer. The entire environmental community was completely together on that point. There was no dissension. There was a different group of people in the industry who said, no. Diesel-fueled hybrid electric buses is the answer. Get the efficiency of hybridization, but we'll use the infrastructure that we already have. And then there were people in the transit agency who would say, you guys are crazy. This all costs us, it's going to cost a fortune. let us just try this idea of taking the sulfur out of the fuel and put a diesel particulate filter on the bus and see what happens. It hadn't been done at scale yet anywhere in North America yet. We fought over that for years. In the end, Governor Pataki and the legislature pulled together a task force, DEC, MTA, all the key stakeholders, and we came up with a clean fuel bus program that said, let's just cut the baby not in half, in thirds. There's going to be a bunch of CNG. There's going to be a bunch of hybrid electric buses. And everything else that's diesel, we're going to put a particulate filter on. And we're going to procure the first ever large scale use of ultra low diesel fuel. And we're going to see what happens. The other thing, and we all agreed to that, that was consensus. Everybody was on it, behind it. And we also agreed that a key piece would be the accelerated retirement of all the two-stroke diesels, about 20% of the fleet at that point. 6 years later, we did a retrospective study. Particulate emissions from the fleet were down more than 95%, even though the fleet was driving 20% more vehicles every year, vehicle miles every year. 90% of the emission reductions came from the accelerated retirement of the old stuff, the two-stroke engines. It didn't matter what fuel or technology was chosen. What mattered was getting out of the old dirty stuff and then putting the best, the most appropriate solution in place where it made the most sense. So in Long Island, the MTA put in natural CNG. In the city, it was a mix principally of diesel, hybrid electrics, and diesels with particulate filters. But we adopted a fuel neutral, technology neutral, performance-based approach. As long as it's as clean as that CNG bus, we Enviros would bless it. It was taking a chance, believe me. I have scars on my back from it. But it was the right choice because we created something that addressed the needs of the fleet, that was able to get to scale fast, that was able to bring down costs, and ultimately be a model that could be adapted and replicated across fleets in trucking, buses, and so on and so forth. Why do I tell that story? Seems to have nothing to do with clean fuel standards, except lesson one, fuel neutral, technology neutral, performance-based approach is the way to go. We humans are not very good at seeing the future. We're terrible at predicting the future. I really think the Islanders are going to win the Stanley Cup this year, and there are a lot of people who think I'm going to be wrong about that. And they're pretty much all going to be right. We're not good at predicting the future. What we are good at is setting performance-based approaches, and we've been doing it since the first Clean Air Act in 1970. And then saying to industry, go innovate, go figure it out. And the fleets are going to decide what's the best way for me to deliver a box or to move a person. And the consumers are going to say the same thing, from the smallest car to the biggest ocean-going vessel and everything in between. That's lesson one. Lesson two, you need a revenue stream. All the mandates in the world aren't worth a hill of beans if you don't have a revenue stream to pay for it and to create the market signals that are going to get us to scale fast. Let me say it again. All the mandates in the world aren't worth a hill of beans if we don't have a revenue stream that's going to help us get to scale fast. It's going to send the right market signals. It's going to create the right incentives. The reason why it took years to get to that place at the MTA, there were a bunch of them, but the big one was who's going to pay for it? Who's going to pay for it? But by the time we actually all shook hands on what the program would look like, there was a 5-year capital program with $800 million dedicated to upgrading the bus system, bus purchases, depot renovations, and so on. And that allowed the MTA, let me give credit where credit is due. It allowed the MTA to say, sure, we're on board, absolutely. Because now we know how to pay for it. We don't have to choose between Do we deliver people to work on time and to school on time, or do we buy a different kind of bus? So lesson 2 is really important. So I have a lot more notes here that I'm not going to go through because it's been a long day and a really good day. But I want to touch on a couple of things that I think are very important here. Senator Parker and Assemblywoman Warner have led the way on the clean fuel standard now for the last several years to try to pass legislation that would bring a clean fuel standard modeled on California but customized for New York to New York. The state of New York is concurrently going through a draft scoping process to develop the plan that will bring New York to meeting climate goals set forth by the CLCPA that was passed a couple years ago. The final scoping plan will be done by the end of the year. Concurrent with that is that we all recognize that there are decades of disproportionate burdens that have been felt by disadvantaged communities all around the state, from Buffalo to Riverhead, and in my dear city of New York in between, and 100 other places, that have breathed diesel particulate pollution, toxic air contaminants for far too long, and deserve to be at the front of the line for once. At the front of the line, not the back of the line, for programs that are going to accelerate decarbonization, accelerate cleanup of particulates and toxics in their communities. And how do we do all that together? And through all that, some themes have come out. And I want to close because I know that we're getting to the end of the day. I'm not going to look at my watch because it says we're at the end of the day. With sharing with you some of the most pertinent concerns that have been raised about the program and provide an answer to each of them. And it's my hope that we all leave here, we go out, we have a few conversations about how to shape a program that, whether it moves through legislation, moves through the scoping process, either way leads to a final rule drafted by DEC that will create what I think would be the best clean fuel standard program for New York, and maybe a model for the rest of the country, but certainly for New York. So what are some of the key oppositions? The Climate Justice Working Group actually has 5. The first, don't allow anything that will extend the reliance on fossil fuels. My response, as we've heard all day today, if there are market signals and incentives that help the MTA, school bus fleets, trucking fleets, and so on move to biofuels in their next purchase order, they're off fossil fuels way faster than just continuing to run on petroleum until they eventually electrify. That's one response. The other response, clean fuel standard goes broader than just the transit buses and school buses under our current state mandates, but it can include the agricultural equipment. It can include construction equipment, heating oil, aviation can opt in. We get to decarbonizing the entire sector, not just the sectors that are maybe most prone towards electrification. That's point 1. Point 2, don't allow any combustion that reduces harmful air pollutants. That makes sense. New York has never met all of the national ambient air quality standards set by EPA ever since we started having those standards. So sure, that makes sense. How do we do that? Well, by setting the appropriate parameters around the program so that we're driving towards the cleanest possible fuels. So we start with California GREET, which obviously focuses on greenhouse, but we can layer on top of that. How do we make sure we're maximizing particulate reduction? How do we make sure we're maximizing a reduction of ozone precursors? We can do that. That's a technical exercise that's worth undertaking. Point 3, don't allow combustion that disproportionately impacts disadvantaged communities. Yeah, of course. Absolutely. How do we do that? Well, most of the transit agencies keep their depots in disadvantaged communities. Disadvantaged communities have less access to publicly available rapid charging. We go through all the different pieces, and they don't have access to all that. How do we do that? We create a program that directs the investment into those communities. The current bill draft from this spring puts that number at 40%. 40% of the credits generated and controlled by the MTA, by the public utilities, go into disadvantaged communities. Well, maybe that's not the right number. I would love to have that conversation with our friends in the environmental justice community, our friends who are thinking hard about how do we make sure we do all the different pieces we need to do to right that historic wrong there. Number 4, prioritize ZEV investments in disadvantaged communities. It sounds a little bit like number 3, but it's actually separate. I know today is all about renewable fuels and biofuels. Absolutely. Absolutely. But we also are sitting in a state that has a legislative mandate to electrify or to go to zero emission vehicles for all transit buses by 2040. How do we do that? How do we prioritize it? Well, here's one idea. The MTA could get off of petroleum as I said, in their next purchase order by calling up Steve Levy and saying, we'd like to buy the renewable diesel and the biodiesel to replace our petroleum diesel, and we'd also like to buy RNG to replace our CNG in all those buses. That would generate credits. Those credits can be monetized. That monetized credit can now be used to accelerate the investment in the ZEV infrastructure that they're not sure how they're going to pay for. By the way, it could also be used to accelerate investment in electrified transit service in disadvantaged communities. Our disadvantaged communities are often also transit deserts where people don't have access to good transit to get to work and school. There's a virtuous cycle here, but it starts with early introduction of biofuels as a way to get that started. By the way, and that's not a by the way, it's actually pretty key. I just didn't get to it yet. The current path of we're just going to do what we do until we eventually get around to electrifying throws a lot of unnecessary diesel particulate into these communities. And I don't think that it's appropriate to say to the parent of a 5-year-old asthmatic kid, don't worry, in 2040, we're going to have an electric bus. I don't think that's appropriate. I think what is appropriate is to say, we're going to shift into a renewable or biodiesel now, which is going to reduce the particulate somewhat, depending on exactly the fuel used. We saw data this morning about that, while we're also moving towards the electrification. We hear you, and I think that's an appropriate way to go. And then the last key critique that comes out a lot is one that actually comes from the alternative fuels work group, who raised the point that some biofuels reduce particulates, but maybe some increase in ozone precursor. My response to that, DEC and all the different stakeholders will ultimately go through a rulemaking process to figure out how do we properly incentivize the lowest carbon intensive biofuels and other fuels, and how do we take steps to make sure that there are no unintended consequences, whether that's PM or NOx in addition. So I started with a story, and I'll end with why I told that story. And then you can go get a cookie or a drink or whatever you want. But it's for this reason. We are terrible at predicting the future. We're terrible at saying this is the one and only technology that can work. I don't care if you're a fan of batteries, hydrogen fuel cells, compressed natural gas, RNG, biodiesel, renewable diesel, ethanol, doesn't matter. What we're good at is creating complementary strategies that move all the pieces forward, that encourage innovation, that then create jobs and economic development. By the way, CFS in New York would generate 9,200 jobs, quick start jobs, and 2.6 billion in new wage income by 2030. We're good at doing those things, but the only way it all comes together is if there's a revenue stream that provides the funding so the fleets that have to make decisions on what fuels to buy, what technologies to invest in, are getting the signal that doing the right thing environmentally is also the right thing for their bottom line. And on that, I'm going to stop. And we saved you some PowerPoint slides, and I hope I gave you something to think about as we move into discussion.
Rich, thank you. That was just as insightful as I expected to come out of you. We do have a question if we have time for one. No, I'm going to get booted. Anyway, I think your answer would have been yes. Had to do with using an LCFS for heating oil or transportation fuel. And I would say, why do you have to be either or? It seems like you could use it for both. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I did say heating oil in my list of fuels at some point in there.
And I did have a question for you along the
Sorry, I
same
didn't
lines,
say
so-
that. If
right.
I had been early in the day, I could have talked more
Thank you
about
very much, folks. Please, another round of applause for my distinguished panel.